In this video, I am going to look at a game I played a couple of Tuesdays ago in the 7th round of this year's Horsham Club Championship. I had the white pieces and was up against James McGrath. I started with d4 and my opponent replied knight f6, c4, g6. Now here I played f3, which is an interesting anti-Grunfeld move order, which I've been looking at recently. Although, to be honest, I expected my opponent to go for a King's Indian, which is what he usually plays. However, here he decided on d5. Bishop g7 will be a King's Indian when e4, d6, knight c3 is the same-ish variation. This is what I expected to see on the board. But, as I said, my opponent decided to play d5, which is a sort of Grunfeld, although because white has not played knight c3, the character of the position is a little different. Play went c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4. Now, as white hasn't played knight c3, black does not have knight takes c3 here and has to retreat his knight to a slightly passive square with knight b6. This is obviously better than putting the knight on f6, where it will just block his bishop when it goes to g7. Play went knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3. And here black chose an unusual move, or perhaps one should describe it as an unusual order of moves, because he decided to play c6. Now, as he follows up with e5, this leads to something that's very similar to more common variations. What black normally does, if he wants to go for a combination of c6 and e5, is play castles first. And then after, white plays queen d2. In situations where black hasn't played c6, white really has to play this move quickly in order to be able to defend d4 adequately. Now the rook can come to d1 either with a direct rook d1 or with castles long. And the aforementioned black formation is now reached after e5, d5, c6. And now white's most combative approach is to play the very direct h4, looking simply to push the h-pawn. Anyway, this line didn't occur in the game, as black decided to play it a little differently. As I said, rather than castling, he played c6. Now, one possibility for white here is to actually go for the direct h4. Because knight c6 is no longer an option, black won't be able to put so much pressure on the d4 square, and this rather frees white's hand to just push the h-pawn like this. It's perfectly possible that this is the reason that many black players have decided to go for this c6 and e5 idea after castling first, because it induces white to play queen d2. Anyway, rather than play h4, white went for queen d2 and black played e5, and white continued with the obvious d5, there's no other way to play for an advantage. C takes d5, E takes d5. And now if black had castled, play would have headed for the more familiar lines, but black instead was tempted by a flashy tactic, knight c4. This is actually a standard tactical device in these kind of positions. The idea is that after bishop takes c4, which white pretty much has to play, black has queen h4 check, forking the king on e1 and bishop on c4, thus regaining his piece and ending up with the bishop pair. However, this really wastes time, and white should have been able to gain a very big advantage here. One way of doing this would have been to play bishop f2, and after queen takes c4, just develop simply with knight on g to e2, knight a6, castles, castles, rook on f to d1, bishop d7, rook on a to c1. And I think it's pretty obvious that white has a considerable advantage here. In the game, rather than bishop f2, white chose g3, which is also a good way of playing it. It slightly weakens the white king side, but this isn't really a big issue. Now, after queen takes c4, which black obviously had to play, white now should probably have just gone for the direct h4. And black's position is just incredibly unpleasant here. He probably needs to castle, but that means he's just walking into an attack. But if he doesn't castle, then I don't think his king's position in the centre is terribly healthy either. However, white was unfortunately tempted by the idea of trying to immediately exploit the position of the queen on c4, but he's not really well enough developed to do this. He played knight e4 with the obvious immediate threat of knight d6 check, forking king and queen, but also introducing the idea of bringing the rook to c1. But after black castles, now things aren't quite as clear as white would like them to be. One issue is that black now has the possibility of playing f5, hitting the knight on e4 and gaining counterplay at a suitable moment. Now, white could have gone for rook c1, but then it seems black could probably just take the pawn on a2, and this is all rather unclear. Obviously, white is going to have some compensation because black is not that well developed at the moment, but then again, white is not particularly well developed either. He needs to play, say, knight on g1 to e2, castles, and then perhaps he'll be able to advance his d-pawn. But still things are not terribly clear here. So understandably, rather than rook c1, he played b3, intending to bring the rook to c1 without having to give up a pawn. Black retreated his queen to a6. white played rook c1. And now black could have considered the immediate f5. And then play might have gone something like bishop c5. This is a neat tactic, as f takes e4 is met by bishop takes f8, and the bishop on c8 is hanging. So instead of f takes e4, black needs to play knight d7. But after bishop takes f8, bishop takes f8, knight f2, the position is rather unclear. Anyway, black didn't go for the immediate f5, but rather played knight d7 first, and then after knight e2 played f5. Now, white, I think correctly, decided that the best way forward was to play knight c5, and then play went knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook e8, castles, bishop d7. Now, white should now have just pushed his d pawn on with d6, when black is forced onto the defensive to prevent its further advance, but his position is very solid, and so this is probably about level. Instead, white tried knight c3, but this gave black an opportunity which, fortunately for white, he failed to take. And that opportunity was to play the active move rook on a to c8. And now the rook on c8 and bishop on g7 are well placed to exploit the awkward position of white's pieces. We can see that the knight on c3 is not really that well placed at all. This position looks favourable for black, but white is certainly not losing here. Anyway, black instead went for the rather more passive b6. And after bishop b4 continued in a similar vein with queen b7. He should have played rook on a to c8 instead, when his position looks perfectly solid. After queen b7, white should have just pushed his passed pawn with d6, and now he's threatening to play knight d5, c7, forking the rooks. And this position looks very awkward for black indeed. Instead, white tried to build up more slowly with a4, but after a5, bishop a3, b5, black seemed to develop adequate counterplay. So play went a takes b5, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, queen takes b5, d6. Now black could have considered grabbing the pawn on b3 straight away, but instead he decided to attend first to the white d pawn with rook on e to d8. And after bishop c5, he took the pawn, queen takes b3. Now, although white doesn't have the advantage here, he still does have compensation for the pawn, as we shall see in the game continuation, which was rook b1, queen e6, rook b7, bishop f8. Black is looking to focus all his forces on white's d pawn, rook d1, rook a6, Now, it looks like the D pawn might be in some difficulties, but now white played the strong queen g5, and here black should have just played rook on a to a8, adopting a solid defensive position when certainly white has compensation for the pawn, but there's no reason to believe that he has any more than that. However, black instead played rook d7, and this allowed white a sequence which would have given him a winning advantage, but unfortunately for him, he didn't spot it, and this was the straightforward rook takes d7, queen takes d7, queen f6. This targets the e5 pawn, bishop g7, and now queen e7. And unfortunately for black, he cannot drop the rook back to a7 because that square is covered by the white bishop. However, white didn't realise that this sequence was possible. He didn't see that he could simply play queen e7 here. And so, rather than rook takes d7, he played rook b8, looking to somehow exploit the pin on the bishop. But black was able to deal with this. King g7, bishop e3. White is angling for queen h6 check, followed by taking on f8. Now, simplest for black would have been king f7, but instead he went for the rather more ambitious f4, which leads to considerable complications. Probably now he was hoping to play for the win, but after g takes f4, bishop takes d6. Now white seems to be in some difficulties, but here he has his surprise response f5, and here black really had to sacrifice his queen with bishop takes b8, f takes e6, rook takes d1 check, king g2, rook takes e6, when white's best is probably queen g4, and this is about equal, although obviously still rather complicated, especially with both players running short of time. However, black either didn't see this queen sacrifice or misassessed it, and instead took on f5 with his queen. But now white pushes on with queen h6 check, and king f7 would just be met by queen takes h7, which is winning. So black played king f6, and here white missed a difficult chance, something that would have been tricky to work out even if he wasn't short of time, and this was the move rook f8 check. Rather spectacular, don't you think? And after bishop takes f8, queen takes f8 check. Now king e6 is met by queen e8 check, rook e7, queen c8 check. picking up the rook on a6, or instead of rook e7, king f6, rook takes d7. Both these lines are obviously winning for white. Now, instead of king e6, black could have tried rook f7, but then white had queen h8 check, and king e6 is met by queen c8 check, picking up the rook on a6, and king e7 is met by queen d8 check, king e6, queen c8 check, again picking up the rook on a6. And if instead of moving the king to e6 or e7, black played rook g7, then the winning continuation was bishop h6, exploiting the pin, rook on a to a7, queen f8 check, rook on g to f7, rook d6 check, forcing king e6, queen e6, when white can simply play rook takes e6 check, winning. So as I said, that would have been a spectacular way to continue, but unsurprisingly, under the circumstances particularly, white didn't consider it. And instead he went for rook takes d6 check, which is spectacular in its own right, but only leads to a draw. Now, taking on d6 with the d rook, rook on d takes d6, is a mistake because of queen f8 check, king e6, queen g8, and white wins. So black correctly took on d6 with the a rook, and now play ultimately ends up in a perpetual check. I'll just give some brief variations to illustrate the direction of play against black's various tries to wriggle out. So white continues queen f8 check, and now rook f7 is obviously not a good idea because the queen takes d6 check. So black would have to play king e6, then white would play queen e8 check, and this is how the game continued. And now black decided to play rook e7. King d5 is just met by king f2, while king f6 is met by queen h8 check. Anyway, as I said, black chose rook e7, white played queen c8 check, and black headed for a repetition with king f6. Rook on e to d7 is met by queen e8 check, which is drawn, as is rook on d to d7, rook b6 check. King d5, though, would be exceedingly unwise on account of rook b5 checkmate. Anyway, as I said, play went king f6, white checked again, and now black sensibly opted for king e6. Rook g7 would have lost to rook f8 check, and king f7 to queen g8 check, king f6, rook f8 check, rook f7, queen takes f7 mate. Instead, black chose king e6, and after queen c8 check, king f6. Black offered a draw, which white accepted, as he has nothing more than a perpetual check.